Hi, I wanted to thank a couple of people, and I appreciate your presence. Artists in Machine Intelligence, the Google group, who have supported this work, especially Ava Konzeka, who has been incredible, and also Nagar and Emily Denton for their ongoing dialogue around this work. Okay, so let me share the screen so we can get into it. Alrighty. So what I'm talking about, well, let me just start with reading from Octavia Butler. When her body calmed and became reconciled to reanimation, she looked around. The room seemed dimly lit, though she had never awakened to dimness before. She corrected her thinking. The room did not seem dim, it was dim. An earlier awakening, she had decided that reality was whatever happened, whenever she perceived. It had occurred to her how many times that she might be insane or drugged, physically ill or injured. None of that mattered. It could not matter while she was confined to this sway, kept helpless, alone, and ignorant. So that's from Dawn, the Xenogenesis trilogy. And I've got one last quote. The aim of generative aesthetics is the artificial production of probabilities of innovation or deviation from the norm. And that's Max Spence from the Projects of Generative Aesthetics, 1965. So my argument with this project is to make AI more wild, not less, by which I mean I indicate a generative possibility for the technology in opposition to the reproduction of the same. The prompt for this line of inquiry is a call for transparency and accountability as an ethics in AI design. So I'm wondering if advocacy toward a corrective can produce the end sought, less harmful bias and more equitable opportunity. What if, outside of the frame of the ethical corrective, one reorients AI applications and ontology? I asked that question in looking at two models of AI production, supervised and unsupervised learning. Either modality can be applied toward harm or benefit depending on local conditions. And yet with unerring regularity, AI produces systemic harmful bias in the design and the application. And there's a whole bunch of references on that I will include in the annotation of the talk. With this background in mind, I argue that unsupervised learning offers a potential AI pathway that challenges the reproduction of the status quo that is endemic to supervised learning. So in lieu of a corrective, how might we consider an itinerant AI to think through things differently than we might? And by think, I indicate logics and processes to discovery that might work outside of predetermined dominant patterns of data processing as a type of generative collusion. AI is a partner as opposed to prosthetic. By we, I point to the position of the self-determining human subject and the legacy of inclusions and exclusions that have informed that position over time. So I ask, in effect, what can AI learn from critical theory, and reciprocally, what can critical theory learn from AI? Okay, so the next slide is literally gibberish, but then we get to one that is not. Okay, so the project explores methods of speculative AI, staking a commitment to the experimental design of machine learning that departs from predictive applications of AI, and again, citing historical bias being built into it. So specifically, I designed an AI system based on the speculative world of celebrated science fiction author Octavia Butler, whose work from the 1970s to 2000s has been a singular voice partly because of her kind of identity frame, Californian, 6'4", 6'2", Black woman who grew up in the 50s and 60s, but also the singularity of her vision in terms of the type of world that she was building. So my Butler AI design centers on the Xenogenesis trilogy, 1984 through 1989, that places Lilith Iopo, a Black woman, as the progenitor of the human race in a near future when the genetic merger with an alien race is the only path to survival once humans have environmentally destroyed the Earth. So in recognizing the critical issues around AI representation, we also understand that there are socio-technological issues. Machine learning presents challenges that are as much cultural as they are as technical. So with this project, I reorder commonplace values and bias in relationship to how a generative system comes to see the world. Okay, so the project design of the Butler speculative AI models other possible worlds in reorienting normative frameworks of AI design. Particularly, I critique the application of default normative training data for the majority of AI systems that replicate and predictably reinstate historical bias along the lines of race, gender binaries, and other modalities of reinstatement of the status quo. The design trajectory for the speculative Butler AI orients itself around precepts, aesthetics, and politics of a Black techne, which is related to Afrofuturism, and there's a whole world of Black studies and critical race embedded in those terms that we could talk about in discussion. And the focus here is a visualization system. Okay, so problem definition. Claiming a space of the imaginary is a non-trivial act. And now we get to the slide. So the inspiration for this project came from a Twitter exchange between AI researchers Timnit Gebru and Jan LeCun. They were going back and forth on the Pulse style GAN that turned President Obama and other people of color white. So Gebru wrote, "I'm sick of this framing. You can't reduce the harm caused by ML to data set bias." So this was June 21, 2020, and all kinds of hell has broken loose since then. And it occurred to me that part of the problem, the inability to recognize frameworks of bias outside of an engineered calculus of data set and belatedly diversity, was a failure of imagination. It seemed that LeCun, who is by no means alone in this, literally could not imagine a world in which white males were not the ML vision standard from which all else departs, the default setting, as it were. And part of my resistance to this is moving toward a process of disorientation. And I'll explain as we're going through the work how that works. So these logics have been reproduced and critiqued in AI with the generation of research publications, conferences, coalitions, and ethics groups. So there's a lot of work on the fixing of the data set, the corrective. And as I mentioned, this project is in the spirit of radical AI and decolonize AI in terms of how can we get to beyond a debugging of a system. Okay, so let me talk about the next part. So Butler as a world builder helps us to orient a process of disorientation. Literally in xenogenesis, it's about engaging with the alien. As project collaborator, architect Snow Zhang writes, "The notion of otherness and otherization is what most fascinated me about Butler. It seems that the biggest hurdle to mutual advancement and collaboration is the human's innate reaction to otherness." I'm reading this as Butler's metaphor for race. So race, I don't know, race is race, but race is also an action, an activity, a setting of a place, a being in relation. So what if we reframe the reference paradigm from a model of the world that is the basis of predictive modeling and reimagine AI as a generative engine that speculates on possible futures? And I need to kind of clarify how speculation works here as a counter to prediction, but I hope that some of that logic is evident as we move through. So returning to Bentz's 1965 framing of generative as that which artificially produces innovation or deviation from the norm, what Bentz points to is the possibility of harnessing machine learning to creative outcomes that do not simply model the past to replicate futures, but rather generate variations. And I would relate this to an uncharted or unmooring of productive outcome which we would link to some of the ideas of poetics of relation of Edward Clisson. So I put the conceptual frame of speculative AI in relation to a discussion of two paradigms of machine learning, supervised and unsupervised. My purpose is to investigate AI practices that move beyond the reproduction of biopolitics of classification. Biopolitics with biopower is a concept that has been developed primarily from Foucault's conceptualization of technologies of power or control apparatus that enacts at a societal level the sorting and managing of populations. So in this sense, productive AI carries on this legacy of ordering as an extension of societal discipline and control. The argument in regard to AI can be summarized in the following statements. Thesis A, structured learning in AI reproduces the society it mirrors, which is often in the form of a system of eugenics or homophily. These are practices of sorting and prioritizing inherited from pre-computational sciences and reflected in social and political standards. So Boker and Starr are a good reference on that. It's a practice of classification and indexing of features that has its origin in the sciences of eugenics. So I cite Fisher, 1936 there. Functionally, labeled data is used to train an ML system. Ontologically, structured learning represents the automated reproduction of a categorical imperative, wherein the conditional for all agents is that of belonging to one category and not another. In this sense, subject and object are distinct in ontology, semiology, and practice. This is a fundamentally binary logic that takes sorting as an a priori, as a precondition for a thing or a state. So thesis B, unstructured learning in AI simulates a monadic environment where an ML system encodes and structures a set of data relations on its own. So formally, data is left unclassified, and the task of ML is to find relations. Functionally, the system designers frame the unstructured learning inputs and often assess and direct system outputs, but there are significant degrees of autonomy and self-determination in an unstructured learning system. Ontologically, unstructured learning represents generative possibility, signaled in this argument with the term wild. AI is a system of production that potentially works in a logic outside the inherited expectation and conditioning, without going so far as to claim a tabula rasa, because none of this is happening in a void or in innocence. A potential primary difference of unstructured learning is a destabilizing of binary processes and outcomes. So two of the papers that I cite in working through thesis A and B are Deep Learning, the 2015 article in Nature by LeCun, Bengio, and Hinton, where they spend time distinguishing between white dogs and white wolves. And I also investigate unsupervised learning and mastering the game of Go without human knowledge. And I look at the paper on AlphaGo 0, which is unsupervised learning. And part of the claims that the researchers make on in regard to this paper, which are particularly interesting to me, is the zero designers describe a generative as opposed to simply reproductive event in which the machine engaged non-standard strategies, that's their language, outside of the scope of traditional gameplay. So the authors stake their investment in ML that teaches how to exceed human capabilities, which is a long-time goal of AI, and also implicates models of mind, these sorts of things. But it's the next bit of the outside of human thinking that's most engaging to me. Beyond beating human experts, Zero demonstrates a quality that speaks to its wildness outside of human thinking. It executes random moves in the beginning of the learning cycle, demonstrating an active process toward determination that does not present a pre-given conclusion. So again, I'm happy to talk about natural language processing, like some of the experiments out in the wild that have gone, essentially to hell, like Microsoft's Tay. and some of the attraction and repulsion around OpenAI GPT-3, but that can be conversation as we continue on. So where I'm going with the Butler program is unsupervised learning offers an unbounded logic away from narrow conditions in the binary. It's not gauging white dog or not white dog. It automates opportunistic. It offers behaviors outside of the preset. So let me go to how we have started to experiment and train with the Butler. Okay, so what I'm looking at is essentially aesthetic framework, so purely creative and generative AI, but also corrective in the sense of thinking through how are we working out some things around the ethical, the responsible, and the representational. And again, this is definitely on the side of radical AI and decolonize AI. Okay, so we ran 2 stages of experiments with the Butler AI addressing visual production. And this project will go on to be an immersive kind of world building full installation, but right now we're focused on visual production. And the procedural goal of the next phase of the process is to build a freestanding ML system where each aspect of the apparatus is accounted for, from training data to algorithmic assessment, which would be how we're modeling unsupervised design. But to begin the investigation, we started with some ready-mades in hand and began with speculative combinations as a testing of the theory if the visual world can be a testing of a theory. So we use Runway ML platform and specifically engaging the StyleGAN2. And I can give you some attributions in terms of the genesis or the genealogy of StyleGAN2 as needed. So for fall 20, we used Google search images of Afrofuturism, a teeny tiny data set, and trained it in relationship to non-human images, specifically botanical images of birds. And then we did a first gen and then a second gen where the images that were the merger of the Afrofuturism with the birds were then reread in relationship to themselves. For Spin 21, we collaborated with artist Gwen Smith and used 700 plus portfolio of black and white Polaroids that were portraits of the people going to the Afropunk annual festival in Brooklyn. So we had a more capacious and also different kind of visual quality and focus with the second data set. So let me, and just heading back to this for a second, you see this is the model for fall 20, Afrofuturist portraits, generative models, artist control visualizations, and outputs. And we effectively are using the same model for spring 21. And now we're heading toward building our own system for unstructured learning. Okay, so this is Gen 0 of the input data, the Afrofuturist portraits interacting with the birds. And you can see in terms of this tile pattern, and I think we're gonna actualize this, heading toward a type of animation where you see the way that on first glance, it's birds, but then if you look at with more care, you see heads and distortions and blobbiness occurring. And then we go to the next cycle, and we have a whole different level of morphology going on there. And then we get to 1600 in terms of the cycle. And this is the one that I'm using, genealogy step 1600, as the title of the paper in terms of kind of locating where we are with this type of experimentation. So for the low fidelity run of this project, as I mentioned, we used existing generative architecture style GAN2. And after loading the GAN modules, the work predominantly rests in crafting the data set and the tiny data set, and then the larger one. And we are having to think through for a much more robust data set for unstructured learning. What else are we going to include, and how do we want to account for things? And then the training time for the GANs. And these, the first experiment was a couple of days. It was quite light. All right, so you saw up to 1600 with the steps, and now I want to show some of the output examples once it had finished the full cycle. So these are, I mean, essentially what we're looking at as portraiture, the individual pieces of, I don't know, these beings that are being generated. And you can see some of its kind of inheritance in terms of the bird-like, and also with the palettes and textures and shapes, some of the inheritance of the Afrofuturist portraits. This is going toward terrain and less the figural, and this is more terrain. Okay, so now I want to talk about Spring 21 and Gen 1 and Gen 2 with the next level of inputs. So as I stated, we worked with silver gelatin black and white Polaroids from Gwen Smith, and we ran it through the same GAN, and we used and we were capturing at step 3000, step 4200, et cetera, about every 1000, 1500 steps, we would pull out the tile to see where we'd gotten to. And as you can see with this outcome, we have a very different type of world that's being conjured here, where you can see and sense. I mean, I feel that there's more of a haunting with these images taken from life, taken from, taken from life. There's a whole body of work about what the photographic does in terms of capturing life that we can, I don't know, refer to. But here you have a sense of the people who would have been there, but you're seeing these kind of echoey mergers with the other source material. So here's a focus on a portrait. And for me, I literally see the ghosting going on, the kind of lives that are moving through. And here's another one. So for G2, with this Spring 21 series, where we started with the black and white Polaroids, we then added other non-human features to it, because I also wanted to see what happens when we kind of profoundly infuse it with color. And this is where we came to with the testing through. And here's some of the portrait details. Okay. So that's the work at this stage. And our task is now to head toward both finessing these images. So I would like to move from digital to analog output around them. So when one encounters them, it's not just simply kind of on a screen in that format, but that's more of an installation question. But for us gathered here, thinking about what is going into our unstructured learning system, since we have some learnings from just working with the GAN. And I would like to just kind of invoke the growing body of literature around decolonize AI and radical AI that I believe that this work is in conversation with, and I look forward to conversation with you. All right, I'm going to stop screen sharing and say thank you, and I'll see you later.